video, I'm going to talk to you about second inversion chords. Second inversion chords are, relatively speaking, quite rare and really only used in certain unique and specific contexts. Also, there are only certain chords that can really appear in second inversion. Generally speaking, it's the 1 chord, the 4 chord, or the 5 chord, and again, those chords only appear in second inversion in very specific circumstances. So I say that up front because what often happens is students hear about second inversion chords and they start using them like first inversion chords. Any chord can be in first inversion, but only very limited chords and in very limited situations can you use a second inversion chord. The second inversion chord creates a very unique sound world that has to be handled somewhat carefully in this style. So let's look at the circumstances where you can use a second inversion chord, but don't take this to be that I'm saying you can just use them whenever you want. These are the few circumstances where a second inversion chord might be possible and where you could employ one. What do we mean by a second inversion chord? Well, of course, we mean that the fifth of the chord is in the bass. That of the 3 notes of the triad, the root, the third, and the fifth, it is the fifth of the chord that is in the bass, and that creates a second inversion chord. As I say, let's look at some examples, and hopefully that will help to clarify things here. So here's the first example. Here we are in C major, and we have 3 chords, a C chord, an F chord over C, that is to say an F chord in second inversion. You can see it's marked by 6/4, which is the figured bass for second inversion, and then it comes back to a root position chord. What happens here is you see the bass remains the same, even though the chord above is changing. So this 1 chord actually becomes a 4 chord in second inversion and back to a 1 chord, but the bass that very progression allows the bass to remain the same. It is the movement of notes above that create the second inversion chord, and in this case the notes here in the upper voices move up and then back down. The chord of the the root of the chord is doubled in this here, and that same root is doubled here, and then in the second inversion the fifth of the chord is doubled. You see that? And the other notes move around it. That is our first hard and fast rule, if you will, guideline, but rule for second inversion chords is you double the bass. And because it's a second inversion chord, the bass is the fifth of the chord. Does that make sense? You double, in a second inversion chord, you double the bass. The bass note is the fifth of the chord, so you're doubling the fifth of the chord. There's 2 ways of saying the same thing. You double the bass in a second inversion chord, the bass is the fifth of the chord. So that's what you see here. You double the bass, and the bass in an F chord over C, C is the fifth of the chord. And it is in the bass. That's what makes it a second inversion chord. So you double the bass, that creates a second inversion chord, and it's a strong doubling with the second inversion chord. It's to double the bass, which is the fifth of the chord. So that's one example of, this is called this is the plagal 6/4, because it is 4 going to 1. It kind of acts sort of like an amen cadence again, with 4 to 1. So it's the plagal 6/4. That's the first type, plagal. The second type is called the passing 6/4. Now the passing 6/4 is where you have a 6/4 between a root position chord and a first inversion chord. So here we have a 1 root position and a 1 first inversion, and we put a 6/4 chord, a second inversion chord, in the middle. So if I look at this second inversion chord, if I look at the notes that are, because this is a 1 chord in C major, this is a C, because this is a first inversion chord, this is an E, those notes are defined by the chord, then that means I have to put a D in the middle. So if this is a 6/4 chord, that D must be the 5th of the chord. So because that D is the 5th of the chord, this must be a G, B, D chord. So indeed, it is a 5 chord in second inversion. You can have a root position chord, a first inversion chord, and in between a second inversion chord, and that chord is then defined by whatever note happens to be in the bass there. So in this case, 1, 5, 6, 4 to 1, 6. Notice that this gives you an opportunity for some extremely smooth voice leading. See how this moves up by step. This top line moves down by step. This middle line stays exactly the same, and this tenor line moves down by step and then back up. This movement of one line going up, one line coming down, one line staying the same, and one line going down and back up is a characteristic of the passing 6/4. The passing 6/4 allows you to do this because essentially this 6/4 chord it's almost like it's happening by accident, because you're joining a root position chord and a first inversion chord together with the notes that happen to exist in between. And it creates a chord by chance almost in the middle, but it's a very distinct chord, and it certainly can be analysed as a second inversion chord. So this is the passing 6/4, and you should look out for opportunities to use this. You'll end up having to have at least the line ascending or the line descending in the bass, because you're either going to go from a first inversion chord to a second inversion chord to a root position chord, or you're going to go from a root position chord to a second inversion chord to a first inversion chord. So this or this will be in the bass. The other lines then fit above it and can occur in any order once you've got the bass line figured out. So this is the passing 6/4. The last one is the cadential. And the cadential 6/4 is probably the most common use of the 6/4. These two certainly exist, certainly you will come across them, certainly you may use them. But this is going to be the one that you will use time and again, and you will encounter time and again. It's very, very common. Again, notice, in fact, just stepping back a moment, notice in the passing 6/4, again, it is the bass that is doubled. Right? The bass or the 5th of the chord that is doubled. In the cadential 6/4, the same thing is true. Here is the 1 chord in 6/4 going to the 5 chord to the 1 chord. This movement of 1 6/4 to 5 is what creates the cadential 6/4. You remember I talked about cadences, and this is a cadence. This is one of those situations where the cadence actually starts a chord earlier than the last 2 chords, because the 1 6/4 is kind of intrinsically connected to the 5 chord going to the 1 chord. In fact, some theorists think of this more as just one big 5 chord, because it's so connected. The 1 6/4 going to 5, going to 1, that's such a logical connection, such an obvious thing to do, and such a common thing to do in this time period, that it's kind of become an entity in and of itself. 1 6/4 5 1 as a cadential 6/4. But again, all the same principles are in play. You double the bass in the 6/4 chord, there is the G doubled. That then can stay the same, because if you can repeat a note, and then the other parts move around it, and then you finish off moving logically to the final 1 chord. This is not octaves, by the way. Octaves occur, you remember when we defined octaves, we said you have to have 2 parts that are an octave apart that move to 2 parts, the same 2 parts, an octave apart. Those 2 parts, if they moved anywhere, that would be octaves. If they stay the same, that is not octaves. That is considered acceptable, especially if the other parts are moving in a contrary kind of motion around them. So, here are the 3 types of second inversion chord. You can use the plagal 6/4, in which case it's going to be a 4 6/4. You can use the passing 6/4, in which case it's really only going to be a 5 6/4. You can sometimes find a 4 6/4 or a 1 6/4 included in this, depending on what chords are occurring around it. But this is the passing 6/4, very smooth voice leading. Or the Cadential 6/4, this is the one you will come across most often, the Cadential 6/4, 1/6/4 to 5/1. Very, very common, kind of comes as a package to end phrases or entire pieces, particularly strong cadential type of pattern. In all 6/4 chords, you double the bass, which is the fifth of the chord. You double the fifth of the chord. And if you do that, you'll find your voice leading will be very smooth. 6/4 chords help to create very smooth voice leading whenever they're used, especially coming into the cadence. It's a very strong way to end your section of music or an entire piece of music in this style period. So that is the 6/4 chord, or the second inversion chord. Now start trying to find opportunities to employ these chords in your own progressions. Thank you.